In the 13th chapter of the Gospel of St. John, verse 1 through 5, we find words recorded like these. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being prepared, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning back to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. On the last night of his life on earth, Jesus combined the role of servant and host and wraps himself with a towel. He assumes the garb and posture of a servant, but the act of hospitality that he offers is the prerogative of the host. In the middle of the meal, Jesus gets up from the table and does something that is unconventional and revolutionary. He performs a task that is usually reserved for a servant of the host. He washes the disciples' feet. What would make Jesus do something like this? Where did the vision and confidence come from to take such a risk? Verse 3 tells us in the text that Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning back to God, got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began to wash his disciples' feet and dried them with the towel that was wrapped around his waist. Jesus' actions pivoted around his identity, his authority, and his destiny. Jesus knew who he was and where he was going. Jesus could assume the posture of a servant and wash his disciples' feet because he had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. James Baldwin, the quintessential writer and playwright, said that the worst creation is a person who has nothing to lose. When a person has nothing to lose or fear, and insecurity is eliminated, their brains come to understand danger and freedom. Danger because there is no safety net for their decision, and freedom because there is a complete absence of no limitation. There's something about conquering our fear of losing everything that we find the courage to risk everything, because we no longer live in fear of what we might lose, and we no longer live in constant fear of losing the safety net, whether it is status or privilege or prestige or relationships or influence or even image. Dr. Edward Wimberly would attribute Jesus' actions to what he called sacred identity formation. Sacred identity formation is the way we are led by God to sort through a variety of cultural conversations and internal conversations about human worth and value until we can learn to privilege and prioritize God conversation. Jesus was able to wash the disciples' feet because he never listened to what society or the culture said about him or who he needed to be successful or effective. Jesus' relationship with God was the source of his identity. And when we know who we are, we know that tasks, no matter how menial or mundane they may be, don't really define us. Tasks, no matter how menial or mundane they may be, cannot alter our identity. On that night in the upper room, when Jesus stooped to wash the disciples' feet, it did not diminish his personhood. It didn't diminish his personhood as the Son of God, because God and God alone bestows the gift of personhood. The image of personhood portrayed in the media and in the culture often runs counter to the gospel. Sometimes the voices of culture and the unrealistic expectations of others can drown out the voice of God. But when we know like Jesus, that we are a gift from God and that we are persons of special promise. Jesus' actions show us that when we know who we are and whose we are, even when we are recruited into other conversations, even when the voices of others and the marketplace try to prevail, we hear and need to hear the voice of God in order to distinguish God's pitch and tenor so that we might facilitate the purpose for which God has given us life in the first place, even if it means washing feet at the expense of our image.